All right, diving right in today, we're tackling a big one, a heavy one, really, the atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945.
Yeah, no easy answers here. It's one of those moments in history that I mean, it keeps you up at night.
Totally. I mean, we all know the basic story, right? World War II, things are looking pretty grim, and then bam, these unbelievably powerful weapons enter the picture.
Exactly, and that's what we're digging into today. Like,
Hmm.
was it really the only option? What led to that choice? You know what I mean?
Right. Was it necessary? That's the question. And we've got some pretty intense primary sources here,
Mm.
firsthand accounts, declassified documents, stuff that really puts you right there in the moment.
It's heavy stuff, for sure. But it's important. We need to understand this, right?
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is how these sources show us the different sides of this debate. It wasn't so simple, like black and white.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. leadership at the time, they were dealing with a lot of pressure from all sides.
Okay, so unpack that for me. What were the main arguments they were grappling with?
Well, yeah, first and foremost, they wanted the war to end. Like yesterday. Who wouldn't?
Right, everyone was exhausted. Years of fighting.
And yeah, they wanted to save American lives, obviously. They were looking at a potential land invasion of Japan, and the estimates were...
Grim.
Grim's an understatement. We're talking millions of casualties, potentially, on both sides. Horrific.
Wow. Okay, so saving lives,
Yeah.
ending the war.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that, right? The sources mentioned something about, like, the U.S.'s global standing.
Oh, yeah, big time. I mean, this was right when the Cold War was starting to heat up. The Soviet Union was becoming a major player, and the U.S. didn't want to appear weak.
So using the bombs was also a way of projecting power. Like,
Yep.
hey, we're the top dog.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about intimidation, I don't think. There was this genuine fear that if the war dragged on, the Soviet Union would gain even more influence in Asia.
And that's something the U.S. definitely wanted to avoid.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, you see, lots of factors all swirling around at the same time. It wasn't a simple equation.
Right, right. It makes you think, though. Were there any other options they could have tried? I mean, the sources do mention some counter-arguments to using the bombs.
Oh, yeah, there were definitely people raising concerns, even back then. And it's
Yeah.
interesting to see those arguments reflected in these documents,
I
you
know.
know.
What kinds of things were they saying?
Well, some historians argue, and there's evidence in these sources to support this, that Japan was already pretty much ready to surrender before the bombs even dropped.
Really? Before Hiroshima?
It's complicated, though. We have this decoded intercept of Japanese diplomatic cables from July 1945, just a few weeks before the bombings. And yeah, it does show that Japan was trying to negotiate. They were sending out peace feelers.
So they were open to ending the war.
It seems so, yes. But there was this major sticking point, the emperor.
Ah, right. Emperor Hirohito. He was considered like a god, right?
Exactly. And the Japanese government, they were adamant that he couldn't be removed from power as part of any surrender deal. And the Allies, they weren't so keen on that idea.
So it was a stalemate. Like, even if Japan was ready to surrender, it might not have been on terms the U.S. would accept.
Yeah, that's the crux of it. It's a huge what if. What if the U.S. had been willing to compromise on that point? Would the bombs still have been dropped? We'll never know.
That's so heavy. It really makes you wonder what other possibilities were there. Like, what about that whole idea, I think I read somewhere about, like, a demonstration of the bomb's power?
Oh, yeah, that was a concept some people floated. They thought maybe if they detonated one of the bombs on, like a deserted island or something.
Just to show the Japanese what they were dealing with?
Right, kind of a scare tactic, I guess, without actually, wiping out entire cities.
It's crazy to think about.
And there's some evidence, yeah, in these sources that that idea was discussed, particularly among the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, the ones who actually built the bombs.
But it ultimately got rejected.
Seems like it. I mean, there are concerns that, Japan might not take it seriously. They might think it was a bluff, or that maybe the bomb wouldn't even work.
So they just went with the more direct approach, I guess.
Yeah, and it's impossible to ignore the human cost of that decision. I mean, when you read about the immediate aftermath of those bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki.
Yeah, it's just devastating. Those names are forever etched in history, little boy, fat man, just awful.
And those numbers, 140,000 people dead in Hiroshima by the end of 1945. Another 70,000 in Nagasaki. It's just unimaginable.
And the long-term effects, the radiation poisoning, the cancers, the birth defects.
Right.
Generations impacted by those bombs.
It's really hard to read those firsthand accounts in the sources,
Mhm.
people describing the horrors they witnessed, the suffering they endured. It makes you question the whole ethics of war, like, where do you draw the line?
It's a question that's still being debated today, right? I mean, there are people who argue that in the long run, the bombs actually saved lives because they prevented that land invasion we were talking about earlier.
Right, right. And on the other hand, you have people who say it was morally wrong, completely unjustifiable, that it opened the door to this terrifying new age of nuclear warfare.
And it's crazy how these arguments still resonate today. Like we're still having this conversation all these years later.
It's because it's such a pivotal moment in history, you know? It changed the world forever. And I think it's important to keep grappling with those questions, to learn from the past, even if there aren't any easy answers.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've touched on a lot of the arguments, the historical context.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that history isn't just dates and facts. It's about people, real people whose lives were forever changed by these events.
Right. Like what about the Potsdam Declaration? We haven't really talked about that yet.
Oh, yeah, that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. It was basically an ultimatum that the Allies, the U.S., Great Britain, and China issued to Japan in late July 1945. It demanded their unconditional surrender.
And how did Japan respond to that?
Well, it's part of the debate. Their response was kind of ambiguous. They didn't outright reject it, but they didn't exactly say yes either.
So maybe they were trying to buy time, or maybe they genuinely were hoping to find some other way out.
Possibly. It was a really tense time. And then, just to add even more complexity to the situation, you have the Soviet Union entering the war.
Oh, right. Just days before Nagasaki. It's easy to forget that part of the timeline.
But it was huge. August 8th, 1945. The Soviets declare war on Japan and invade Manchuria. And a lot of historians believe that this actually played a big role in pushing Japan towards surrender.
How so?
Well, some sources suggest that Japan had been hoping to use the Soviets as a kind of intermediary to negotiate a peace deal with the U.S., maybe on more favorable terms for them. But when the Soviets declared war, that hope went out the window.
So they were basically stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Pretty much. The U.S. demanding unconditional surrender, and now the Soviets attacking from the north. It was a desperate situation.
Wow. So many moving parts. It really makes you wonder how it all factored into the final decision to use the bombs. Like, was it always a foregone conclusion? Or did the Soviet entry into the war tip the scales?
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure, but I think it's important to remember that these weren't just abstract decisions being made in some far-off war room. These were choices that had real human consequences for millions of people.
And those consequences are still being felt today. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki cast a long shadow.
Absolutely. They shaped the entire world's view of nuclear weapons. They ushered in this new era of fear, the possibility of total annihilation, and that fear, sadly, is something we still live with today.
So what can we learn from all this? I mean, it's a lot to process.
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to be incredibly careful with powerful technologies, especially weapons. We have to think about the long-term consequences of our actions, not just the immediate goals.
And maybe also remember to approach these kinds of historical events with, with nuance, with empathy.
Exactly. There are no easy answers here, no simple heroes or villains, just people trying to navigate an incredibly complex and difficult situation. And it's up to us to learn from their mistakes to try to build a better future where these kinds of tragedies never happen again.
It's a lot to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now about the devastation these bombs cause, about the long-lasting effects. I mean, how should we remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki? How can we honor the victims? And how can we use this knowledge to guide our actions in the present to make sure that we never repeat those mistakes? I don't know. It's something we all need to grapple with.
Heavy stuff. Definitely gives you a new perspective on things. Thanks for helping us unpack all that.
Anytime. It's important to have these conversations, even if they're tough.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for our deep dive today. But as always, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep learning. We'll catch you next time.